Howdy, all you delicious people! I'm here today to review Neighbors from 1981. So, I think a lot of people will probably quickly compare this film to the other Dan Aykroyd film, The Great Outdoors, with John Candy. Or a lot of people will probably say, like, well, hey, like, what about the other Neighbors movie, the Zac Efron, Seth Rogen movie? That is okay, but I just don't really find it all to really be that comical. But anyways, I went on and I watched this movie called Neighbors, and I laughed so hard during this film, and it's been a while since I've really laughed pretty well in a film. So this movie is to feel like the joke that never ends, and there's a lot of complicated moving parts within this movie also. And immediately when thinking of all what happens in this movie, I'm like, oh my god, I don't know how I'm going to keep this all together. It's probably going to be me having to maybe go back a little bit through the spoilers. But I had so much fun with this movie. I easily thought it was bizarre, but fun. Like, this movie also kind of reminded me of The Burbs, the Tom Hanks movie, The Burbs, where we have kind of this nosy neighbor hoping that these people are going to be easygoing, and they're nowhere near that. Even to where it seems that this almost turns into a What About Bob kind of situation, where the new people are to come in, and all of a sudden now even Earl's wife is kind of working against him here, or his daughter that somehow comes in the fold for some reason that I don't quite understand why they added in this character in this film. But hey, giving people work is always great. But I just didn't quite understand why they needed a daughter for this movie when it just feels like this character didn't have much to do here. Uh, so, with that said, definitely a great film. Where can you go on and check this movie out and teeing it up? What is it really about here? So, I would say that you can go on, and the only place that I could conveniently find this movie for absolutely free would be Crackle. Every once in a while, I would go on and find myself going into Crackle, but like that is usually like the last case scenario. I couldn't find this anywhere else, so I just went into Crackle and saw it for absolutely free via the second of this recording. It may not be on Crackle forever, so go and check it out now. So, with that said, uh, what is this movie technically about? So, it's pretty simple, like I kind of almost explained it. Uh, we have these neighbors come in, and slowly but surely, we just keep having both Vic's character and Ramona's character consistently getting into Earl's head, so much to the point that once we get further and further into this movie, the more Earl is to decide, like, you know what, like, I really like these people. They're kooky and they're loony and they're whatever, but somehow I just like these people. And Earl just completely gives in to these characters, like, regardless of rationale. Because really, towards the end of this movie, this guy completely loses it and just goes on onto an adventure that is like, what? So, with that said, let's just go on into spoilers, because definitely I would have people figure out a way to say they can see this movie because it's well worth it. It's a John Belushi, Dan Aykroyd film. So definitely has some really good jokes, some really good character work. So let's go into that double five time territory, because it's about that time to just go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time again to spoil this movie. So let's get into it. So I say that because there's a lot of moving parts in this film, and I hope that I can nail everything, so to speak. So, with that said, in the very beginning of this film, we have Earl and Enid who come home from a long day. So they both come into the house, and we have Earl who's looking on at this uh, like phone tower, or it's like a electricity tower that's nearby his home, and so it seems to only be him and one other home next to him, and so Earl goes into the house, starts watching some telly, and all of a sudden Eden is saying, "Well, it's about that time." Uh, Earl, of course, is asking, "Well, hey, do you need any help?" And Eden is like, "No, I found this great recipe for this capon, and it only takes 2 minutes." And Earl is like, "Okay, great." So Enid goes into the kitchen and starts making what eventually won't be capon. So Earl then is to poke his head out the window to notice that there's a truck there, and that there's also a U-Haul trailer, and so uh, we of course have Earl going on and saying like, "Well, hey, like it seems that someone is to move into the Warren place," and like it seems like a very odd time of night to move in. But come to find out, Enid will say that she had seen these neighbors earlier in the day, but she didn't tell Earl that. So Earl is to hope that there isn't any kind of kid involved uh, with this couple, and he doesn't think that he sees any kind of kids' furniture, so they might be safe on that front. But eventually, Earl is to see a dog, and so he is to talk to Enid about, like, oh my god, they have a dog. Like, something's gonna happen. This dog is gonna, like, dig into my flowers or any number of, like, bushes or whatever, and it's gonna be a pain. So, we have Earl that is talking to Enid and saying that I think we should go on and invite these people over tonight. And Enid's like, well, maybe tomorrow. And Earl's like, well, tomorrow isn't tonight, hon. And so we have Earl that is to get a knock at the door, and come to find out it is a woman named Ramona. So Ramona is to make her way into Earl's home and is to spot this picture and ask what exactly this is a picture of. And so Earl is to mention that this is of his daughter, a girl named Elaine, I think. So Elaine isn't really much of a factor in this movie. Like, she's just there a little bit, but like it doesn't really seem like this character really has a true purpose in this film, honestly, besides just kind of chiming in just like his wife does in this film. But it is what it is in this movie. Get get people work. That's all that really matters, right? So Earl is speaking with Ramona, and so Ramona is mentioning how she really wants to get very close with her neighbors, and Earl is saying how close they were with the Warrens, and Ramona's like, "No, I mean very, very close." As we kind of have Ramona that is kind of throwing her legs on to Earl's thighs, and so it seems that Earl is to mention to Ramona that that Eden is making a great capon, and that will be something that they can welcome them into the neighborhood with. And so all of a sudden, we have Earl go to talk to Enid, and all of a sudden she is making frozen waffles. And so now Earl's like, "What are you doing?" And Edith's like, "Oh, all we have is frozen waffles." And he's like, "What? What about the great capon that you mentioned?" She's like, "Oh, well, I'm not going to do that tonight." Why even mention it? So we now have Earl that is telling Edith, it's like, well, hey, like the neighbors had showed up and I'm promising them this meal. Do we have any cheap steaks? And Edith is saying, like, no, I would never go on and buy cheap steaks. So Earl then is to make his way back into the living room to now have to scramble to think of food. And all of a sudden, he now bumps into Vic here, who is actually Dan Aykroyd's character. So Earl talks to Vic, and Vic is to say like, well, hey man, like I'm very hungry. I could eat a boar. Like what do we got? And so Earl is telling Vic that it seems that there has been some miscommunication about the food. And so Vic is like, well, hey, no sweat. Like, let's go on and just get some takeout. And so he's like, maybe some burgers or something like that. And so we have Vic who mentions that his car like is having trouble with the brakes. So Vic is asking to borrow Earl's car, and Earl's like, well, can I just drive with you? And Vic is like why? Like if you're gonna go on and fork over the dough, I'm gonna go and get the food for you. Like just like believe me. So, because like Vic is telling Earl, it's like you don't think I'm gonna steal your car? Like you know where I live. And so Earl is like, okay. So we have them talk about getting possibly some Italian food. And so Earl is to then go upstairs to eventually notice that all of a sudden Ramona is upstairs in this bed without clothes on. And Ramona is to mention that, of course, she was to change and this and that. And Earl is like, well, that's fine and all. All of a sudden, Ramona's bed sheet is to drop, and Ramona is to reveal herself to Earl. Earl is to turn and then is to desperately try to get Ramona to get her clothes on for Earl to leave the room. And all of a sudden, Earl is now seeing Vic going through Earl's things. And Earl is asking Vic, hey, what are you doing? Because Vic is going through Earl's checkbook. And Vic is like, oh, I was just looking for like a pencil and paper to write down everyone's menus, and this is all that I saw. I'm sorry. Like, I overstepped my bounds. And so Earl is just saying like, well, hey, like, if anything, if you're just going to an Italian place, get like spaghetti and meatballs, kind of the very basic stuff. And Vic is like, oh, okay then, all right. So Vic then is to go on and take this car, and he doesn't drive very far. So what Vic ends up doing instead, and Earl catches this, Earl is to spot Vic just drive right to his home after Earl had gone on and given him $32 to get this Italian meal. And we have Vic who's telling Earl, it's like, well, hey, like, you're gonna, like, it's 4 grown people that we're forking over money for, and all you have is $32. And Earl thought the last thing that he had out of his wallet wasn't a $2 bill. He thought it was a $20 bill. So they're like bickering over how much money to spend. So we have Earl who is to spot Vic going and driving next to his house. And so Earl then goes on and investigates to see what the heck is going on. So we have Earl go outside to eventually realize that Enid did have cheap steaks, but she's kind of lobbing them out to this dog to feed him, probably so that way this dog could consistently come over there and ruin Earl's house at some point and crap all over his garden or whatever. So Earl is to make his way to check out his car, and then he goes over to see what Vic is doing. Vic is actually just home making the whole entire Italian meal at his place, just getting spaghetti and noodles and certain ragu and pouring this all into something like, okay, I guess this is going to be good enough. One thing of noodles falls on the ground, and Vic picks it up and puts it back in the meal. 5-second rule, I guess, right? Yeah. So, Vic, because... Or Earl, because Vic was doing that, Earl is kind of now upset, and so Earl goes and takes Vic's car after he takes this brick from under this wheel, is to want to go on and just kind of push this car, and he realizes that he pushes it too hard, and all of a sudden the car continues to roll, and Vic was to mention before that his brakes were out, and Earl had forgotten that. Earl jumps out of the car, and the car goes into the swamp. And now Earl's like, oh my god, I'm gonna pretend nothing happened. So, all of a sudden, we have Earl just kind of slowly but surely making it back into the house. And now Earl sees Ramona, and Ramona is telling Earl, I saw what you did. I saw what you did to that car. And Earl is like, well, hey, you guys have insurance, right? So if anything, there's just going to be a $100 deductible. I'd gladly pay it for that mistake that I had done. It was just a simple joke. And so we, of course, have Ramona, who's just like, well, that's not good enough. You're going to pay me $500,000. And Earl's like, for what? And Ramona is like, well, for my silence. And Earl's like, wait a minute, you're blackmailing me? And Ramona's like, you bet I am. And so we have eventually Vic that makes it back and is to produce this dinner. And so they all sit down at this dinner table, and we now have Earl that is asking Vic where he got this meal from. And so Vic starts to go on, and is to mention, it's like, well, I went to this Italian place in this mall that just so happened to be open, right next to this, like, movie theater. And Earl is like, really? Isn't that weird? Because the mall that you're talking about, that mall is closed, and there is no theater there, and there is no Italian joint, so where'd you go on and you got this from? And so finally, we just have, after all this questioning, we have Vic who confesses that he, of course, was to just home make this at home, but he had his mother's famous recipe. And Edic's like, see that? He gave us some secret recipe from his mother's. And so Earl is just like, yeah, but he lied. But then all of a sudden the tables are turned, and Ramona is like, well, Earl, how about you tell Vic, like, your secret? And Earl's like, no, I don't think we'll go into that. And they're like, what? Like, what? And so Earl is mentioning to Ramona that he will agree to the figures that she had mentioned before, as long as they don't go into it. And so they're like, what? Like, what did he do? And so Ramona is to turn to this couple and tell both Enid or Enid and both Vic that Ramona was porked by Earl. Earl had porked me. And so all of a sudden they're like, oh my God. Huh. And so all of a sudden Vic is so angry that he falls back into his chair. He's so angry. And so Vic is going like, you know what? We could have been real friends, Enid. But like, I think that time has passed. Ramona, let's get out of here. So Earl is now talking to Enid. Like there is possibly like the cops being called, or Edith is to be tempted to call the cops, and Earl is telling Edith how how do you think that I could have gone on and porked this woman? And so Ramona is saying that Earl's hand was in her bush, and that's how he porked her. And I'm just like, whatever with this. Porked, sure. So now after that, we now are of course to have Dan and Ramona going back to their place, and we then are to go on and oh my God, we have Earl trying to go and I think this is the point where Earl is to all of a sudden get a knock on his door, and so he opens up this little mailbox, and Ramona is there telling that he wants to meet with Earl, and Earl then goes on and is to kind of clean himself up quickly in this bathroom and tries to go on and sneak out. So eventually when Earl is to try to sneak over to get to Ramona's place, all of a sudden there ends up being these alarms sounding, and now Vic is to have like this shotgun and the scuba gear and this headgear and all this equipment on, because Earl was to go on before Vic and Ramona had left. Earl had mentioned to Vic that his car is in this swamp and that they should go on and like try to retrieve it if they like. There was also a moment when Earl's daughter Elaine was to come home from being expelled from class, and Earl, of course, goes on. God, I'm trying to think of how exactly this is all broken down, because I'm thinking this way, but I'm not quite sure. So Elaine is to bring in these edible panties, and Vic goes on and starts eating them, and now he has this joke about eating Earl's daughter's panties, and Earl takes it too far, punches him in the face, and so now we have Earl trying to go over there to make amends with Vic having all this equipment on. And so Earl is to finally say, like, hey, let's make amends here and let's talk things out. So Earl then goes with Vic to try to have a thing of coffee, and every single time Earl does not want this one cup that has this makeup smear on it. So Earl tries to switch the cups, and we, of course, have Vic that switches it back, and Vic is to pour this coffee into this cup, and Earl pours the coffee into his hand and says, like, I'm going to rinse this cup out, And Vic's like, oh no, like, no, like, you're fine. Like, and like, you're going to ruin all the coffee. And, but Earl is just like, well, then can I, like, wash my hand off? Because I'm going to pour this coffee back from my hand into this cup. And Vic's like, well, no, like, you came here to talk. So Earl just pours the cup, or pours the coffee back into the cup, talks with Vic. And so they end up trying to hash it out, and Earl was asking Vic what was he going to have all that scuba gear and all that stuff for, and Vic really wanted to go on and retrieve like his possible truck or his plane that was in that truck that Earl was to see from earlier before. So Earl and Vic both go out there, and what happens is that it seems Earl ends up falling into this sinkhole, and we now have Vic asking Earl consistently if when Vic was with Ramona earlier and the sheet fell in the bed, did Earl have that sheet falling thing be an accident, or did Earl with his mind will that to happen? And Earl is saying, like, no, like, it was all an accident. And Vic is like, really? And then he just keeps asking until uh, Earl is to almost be drowning. And so he's like, fine, like, I willingly did it with my mind. And so Vic then grabs the stick, is to try to pull Earl out. And then Pearl goes on and uh, flings Vic back into the sinkhole. And then Earl realizes that Dan is now, or Dan, Vic is now so far in there that he must be dead. So Earl goes back looking like Swamp Thing as both Enid and Ramona are talking, of course, about Earl. Earl's looking through the window and eventually goes into a room that is to have this shower, and immediately once he opens up the shower curtain, we all of a sudden have Vic going, and so now Earl, afraid of Vic, is to all of a sudden be like, oh my god. So Earl shoves Vic out of the room, locks the door, and actually realizes he accidentally breaks the door by doing this. So Earl then is to take a shower, and then when he comes out of the shower, he realizes that Ramona is sitting on this pool table. And so Earl is like, oh, so that's the routine. Like, since Vic did something, now you have to do something. I get what it is now. I get all this routine now. So now I even noticed that too. I was like, what the heck? What is up with this rotation? So we have Earl talking to Ramona, and so eventually at one point Ramona is to pick up this little vase or this little like cylinder, and Earl is to desperately tell Ramona to please put this cylinder back, and so she does. And so while they continue to talk about things, we then have Ramona, who is playing pool and is to uh, go on and hit the uh, the the white ball of the pool table so hard that all of a sudden it's almost hits, of course, Earl, and then Earl kind of falls back, and the whole shelf of all those cylinders and all those vases or whatever they were all fall over, and Earl's like, oh my god, like I spent years collecting those. Sure you did. So now after that, Vic is now back. He's all like shorts and shirt, and everything is wonderful. So we then just go on and have Earl trying to just quickly get out of this room to lock them down there. And so now Earl is to call this locksmith, and this has got to be the funniest part of this film. After Earl is to talk to Edith and say that these people are lunatics and like he can't deal with them and so on and so forth, like all this kind of stuff. So Earl is to call this locksmith to try to get the door downstairs to be opened so they can just eventually leave through that door. So when Earl calls the locksmith, all of a sudden Vic is to also pick up the phone. And so while Earl is trying to talk to this locksmith, trying to get this this door open, we consistently have Vic, who's trying to be like the Exorcist, is going on like your mother sucks cock in hell, and all this kind of stuff. And the locksmith is like, say what now? And like Earl is drinking again. Like, Earl, what are you talking about there, buddy? And so Earl is saying like, no, Vic's on the phone. He's trying to pull a prank. Like, I'm sorry, sir. Like, if you could just come down here. And like Vic is telling this locksmith, never call here again. And so the funniest part of this movie, I laughed so hard in this part of the film. So after that, all of a sudden, there is to be some horror sounds into where both Vic and Ramona's room is. And so we have Earl and Enid talking to one another about what's going on, what they're hearing. And it sounds like Vic is going to lob off Ramona's leg. It's like, oh, please give me one of your legs. You promised me one of your legs. And so all of a sudden, like Earl is like, he's not going to hurt this woman. I don't believe it. And it's another prank. It's another joke. And Enid is telling Earl, it's like, well, maybe Vic is a vivisectionist. And Earl's like, oh my God, he could a vivisectionist? And so Earl runs down there thinking that Ramona is in jeopardy. And come to find out instead, Earl is to get himself locked into this room. And now Enid, Ramona, and of course Vic are having a good laugh as Earl is now stuck down there. So Earl is trying to call this tow truck, thinking it'd be the good deed to try to get Vic's car out of the swamp. And so it seems that when Earl is to call this tow truck, it seems that it was already called. This guy named Pa was to get this call and say, like, well, like, it seems that some guy named Vic was to call before and say that you were to do, like, some horrible things to him. And so Pa's all of a sudden slamming Earl and, like, saying all of this horrible things to this guy as if he hates him. And Earl then hangs up the phone and is seeing through the opening of this window that the tow truck, instead of going and getting Vic's car, is instead towing away Earl's. So Vic then is like, oh my God, my car is getting towed. So when the tow truck guys come back, they're like, hey, there was nothing wrong with this car. And Earl's like, well, of course not, because there was a whole, like, misspoke. And so instead, like, Earl wanted the other car out of the swamp to be retrieved, and eventually they do. So we, of course, are to then have Earl, who is to make it out of this room and is to kind of look throughout the house. And so right here, I feel I'm kind of lost at this point. So because I feel like I've probably gone on and said a number of things earlier that happens later, but it is what it is. So after this moment here, oh, I think I might have gotten something confused, because I think when after Earl confesses to Vic about that his car is in the swamp, both of them end up going and looking for said car, and the time of which where Earl goes on and meets up with or punches Vic and then goes back to his home to try to make amends. That all happens here. And I think that that all happens simply like that. So now that we've gone all to that, after those moments, we have Earl, who is to go and notice that his car is to have a broken axle and he cannot drive it. So when Earl is to talk about that eventually, why can't Vic go on to certain locations, or why can't he leave? And they're like, well, hey, like, his car is broken. So, like, his axle doesn't work, and it's all your fault, Dad. So, his brakes was also out anyways. They could have gotten the tow truck to just get his brakes fixed. So, but anyways, that car is just kind of consistently useless. So, it seems like all of this is to happen in one fell swoop of a night. They're talking about how late it is and how it's like 2 in the morning. So we have like seemingly the next day. And so if Earl hasn't gone on and had any sleep throughout the last portion of this whole night of things, Earl eventually is to consistently try to get seduced by Ramona, to where she keeps showing up in his bed, and Earl the second time around is just so wanting to just go on and jump into bed with Ramona. And we have Ramona who is doing some inventory, and it seems that Earl is to be listening to something outside. And so Earl is saying, hey, there's too much noise going on outside. I can't concentrate. Come to find out, we have Vic, who is taking this motorized plane that he had from his car, and he's playing with it. So when Earl is to make it out of his room, he is to talk to his daughter that is mentioning, of course, like, oh, like, are you talking to Mom? And Earl's like, no, like, it's not like that, honey. So Earl then goes on and is to eventually find out that Vic had gone on and crashed his plane into his own house, and that started a fire. And so now when Vic is to make his way back into this other house, Vic is to mention all about this fire and that he's on flames. We also had the one moment in this movie where Baby the dog was to also get electrocuted by that electrical tower. And so when Vic touches the dog, all of a sudden it seems like the dog is back to normal again. Because I guess there was some mistakes for that electrical tower thing within this movie. I forgot about it. So But so we push on, and Earl at some point is seeing Ramona again, talking to her, to mention that it will happen between the two of them, and that they're going to go on and have a meal together, and so on and so forth. And we have Ramona. It's like, well, I know what I'm having for dessert. So uh, we have Earl going, and is to think that this fire is all a lie, that Vic is to make it up, and that somehow Vic is to probably just get like this to be another joke. All of a sudden, they look outside, and this house is now all fallen together, and we really just have the firefighters who are going on and just saying like, well, like all we're gonna need now is just some s'mores because there's nothing we can do. So now that Earl is to realize that Vic is to somehow lose his house, and Earl has been so harsh to Vic, Earl finally is to just like go on and try to be a nice guy here, because Vic and Ramona are to be tempted to move out here and move on because they can't live in this house anymore. So we are having all these people going to have this dinner, this one last meal before Vic and Ramona leave. So we have Earl that is questioning them about like, well, hey, like you have insurance on the house, right? Like, how did you guys pay a mortgage for this house if you don't have insurance? Come to find out, they had stolen this house from the previous owners and just decided to start living there because the Warrens had been a like moved to, or the wife of the Warrens had went on to go to this retirement home, and Vic, I guess, was the orderly there that was taking care of her. And so, since Vic knew where this girl lived in the past, he just went to her home and stole her house, and then just started living there. And so, there's no insurance on the house, so there's nothing that they can do. Because Earl is like, oh man, you guys must be like in a fortune now, because of the insurance that you took out on this. Yeah, not so much. So Vic confesses all that. So now, like, these two are leaving, and they have nothing. They have nothing now. And so Earl, because all of the things that they've put up with, Earl just goes on and just gives them this car. He gives him his car and says like, "Here you go. This is your car. Uh, go on and just like go, you guys." And all of a sudden, by the time they leave, Earl is to also ask Vic about his checkbook, and Vic is like, "Seriously, you think I stole your checkbook from you?" So Earl is now asking Enid to go and look for his checkbook. Enid goes and shows Earl this checkbook and the money that is left in there, and so he's like, "Okay, well." Then Earl gives Vic and Ramona the car, and so they drive off. So somehow or another, we have Earl's daughter that was to have been suspended from her school, but all of a sudden someone else confessed for Elaine's crime, and so she, I guess, was to be able to go back to school again. And uh, we also had Enid, who wanted to, when they had more money, to go back to certain classes to thoroughly go into some Native American studies. So Earl is seeing his daughter leave, and then his wife leaving to have this all of a sudden head to toe Native American getup, and is going with a Native American called Thunder Sky. So they go off together, and so all of a sudden Earl is just left by himself, and all of a sudden a car ends up pulling out, or pulling in, I mean, and it's Vic and Ramona who are telling Earl, "Hey, like, how about you just kind of come with us, buddy? Like, we just feel like we miss you, and we want you to come with us." And so Earl is in shock of this, and he's like, "Well, yeah, like that sounds a reasonable thing, but let me go on and leave Enid a note." So we had Earl at one point seeing this portrait of this family of his, and so Earl goes and sees his portrait and is to bash his head through it, and then is to set the whole house on fire after he chucks this TV against this wall, and the house lights on fire. So Earl walks away from the home with the house burning down, and Vic's like, "Well, yeah, you weren't kidding about leaving that note." And Earl's like, "Well, yeah, like, Enid likes to come back to the house, um, not in the dark, so I thought I would help her by by leaving her a light on." So Earl, Vic, and Ramon are all driving away, and that's how the movie ends. And I'm like, thank God, because I made some mistakes here, but I went on and tried to save things. So my absolute apologies if I kind of messed up the order, but I tried to get everything somewhat ballparkingly correct. But with that said, there were some scenes that I didn't know the order of, but I knew they happened. But yeah, it was a bit of a mess to try to like retain everything. So with that said, let me know in the comments below how you felt about this review. Uh, Either way, because I had gone on to just try to like do some kind of assessments or to try to figure out where certain scenes were, but I'm like, yeah, like once we got to like the back half of this movie, like I'm a little hazy on the order of things. Um, but either way, I gotta say I enjoy this film. Check it out regardless of how much I butchered the out of it. So with that said, goodbye everybody. Bye everybody.